Good morning, dear students. Welcome to our lecture, which is belonging to subject classical and modern literature. So this is our 8th lecture, and today's lecture we will learn about the Edwardian period. That is, in today's lecture, I will introduce Edwardian period in English literature. So I'll give you information to 20th century poetry and drama, also analyze George Bernard Shaw's works which is belonged to this period. The Edwardian period of British history spanned the reign of King Edward VII, 1901 to 1910, and it is sometimes extended to the start of the First World War. The death of Queen Victoria in January 1901 marked the end of the Victorian era. Her son and the successor Edward VII was already the leader of a fashionable elite that set a style influenced by art and fashions of continental Europe. Samuel Hance describes the Edwardian era as a leisurely time when women wore picture hats and did not vote, when the rich were not ashamed to live conspicuously and the sun really never set on the British flag. So this period of time, the Liberals returned to power in 1906 and made significant reforms. And in this period, we know that liberalism is well known. So what is a liberalism? Liberalism is a political and moral philosophy based on the rights of the individual, liberty, consent of government, and equality before the law. So, below the upper class, the era was marked by significant shifts in politics among sections of society that had largely been excluded from power, such as laborers, servants, and the industrial working class. So, women started to play more of a role in politics in society in this period of time. We know that this Edwardian period is belonged to the 20th century. The most striking thing in 20th century English literature is the revolution in poetic taste and practice. Various movements and changes had a greater influence upon modern poetry. Though poets are often influenced by each other and sometimes share a common outlook, their style and the ways of writing differ from each other. So, according to their writing, we can differentiate their works between them. So, modern poetry is essentially a private art form and it contains very much a story of individual poets. The 20th century poets are. Here we give photos of 20th century authors. Firstly, Eliot, Yeats, and Thomas Hardy, Gerard Manley Hopkins, Auden, Thomas, Philip Larkin, and Simmons Heaney. So, when we talk about 20th century literature, we can remember these authors and their works. So, now I would like to introduce you some authors of this period. We said that this period mainly belonged to wartime. So, most of authors' works is belonged to describe actions, events, cases in World War. So, the first author, when the World War came in 1914, the poets' minds were filled with the heroic and the nationalistic feelings. Their poems give a romantic and a patriotic view. So, here given a Robert Brooke. Robert Brooke wrote representative poems giving a traditional view of war. His 5 war sonnets represent the romantic and the enthusiastic feelings of the people. But in the later poets, we see that sad realities of war. The next is Siegfried Sassoon. Siegfried Sassoon had fought in France and seen the deeds and destruction. In his poems, he expresses his anger towards the uselessness of war. He hated the patriotic people of England who just believed the government propaganda and were unknown about sorrows and the sufferings of the soldiers. He was himself wounded in the war in Europe. So, with the help of his works, he tried to support the soldiers. The third author is Wilfred Owen. He is the most popular poet in World War I. His poems show the danger, discomfort, and suffering of soldiers in the trenches. They show how war harms the minds and happiness of the soldiers. In his poem Strange Meeting, he describes that even the enemy soldiers are human beings like them. So, we can say that all of these authors try to understand people and support. So, in Disabled, he wrote about the soldiers disabled by war. He himself died in the war. The next author is Isaac Rosenberg. Isaac Rosenberg came from a working-class family and served as a common soldier during the war. His language was not so refined, but it had a great life and energy. The difficulties of the trench life and the inhumanity of killing is described in his poems. Break of day in the trenches and the dead man's damp. All of these authors try to explain to the government, which is a war is wrong and it is might be affected to people badly, that might be affection to the humanity, society, and people. Even they are in war, they didn't stop at writing. The poets of the World War II very different, as many people had suffered the darker side of life during the after-war period. They did not have the same hope and enthusiasm. These poets often showed a sense of tiredness and sense of helplessness. The language was also plain and simple. Some of the poets of World War II were Sidney Case, Ellen Lewis, Roy Fuller, and Case Douglas. Here given photos of these authors: first Sidney Case and Alan Lewis, and etc. 20th century British theatre is commonly believed to have started in Dublin, Ireland, with the foundation of Irish literary theatre by William. Its Lady Jodrey and Sinch. Their purpose was to provide specifically Celtic and Irish venues that produced works that stage the deeper emotions of Ireland. The playwrights of the Irish Literary Theatre were part of the literary revival and included Sean Casey, Singe, and Eats, Lady Judgery, and Edward Martin, to name a few. In England, the well-made play genre was being rejected and replaced with actors and directors who were committed to bringing both reform and a serious audience to the theatre by appealing to the younger, socially conscious and politically alert crowd. In the play, George Bernard Shaw, Hayley Granville Barker, Somerset Maugham, and John Galsworthy characters emulated this new crowd, satirized the well-made play characters, and created new stereotypes and new standards. The early 20th century denoted the split between folks and frills drama and the serious works, following the footsteps of many European countries. In Britain, the impact of these continental innovations was delayed by the conservative theatre establishment until the late 1950s and 1960s, when they converged with the counterculture revolution to transform the nature of English language theatre. The West End, England's Broadway, tended to produce the musical comedies and the well-made plays, while smaller theatres and Irish venues took a new direction. The new direction was political, satirical, and rebellious. Common themes in the new early 20th century drama were political, reflecting the unease or rebellion of workers against the state, philosophical, delving into the who and why the human life and the revolutionary, exploring the themes of colonization and the loss of territory. They explored common societal business practices, conditions of factories, new political ideologies, or rather repressed sector of the population. Industrialization also had an impact on the 20th century. Drama resulting in plays lamenting the alienation of humans in an increasingly mechanical world. Not only did industrialization result in alienation, so did the wars. Between the wars, two types of theatre reigned. In the West End, the middle class attended popular conservative theatre dominated by Noel Coward and Bernard Shaw. Commercial theatre thrived and at a Drury Lane large budget musicals by the Ivor Novello and Noel Coward used huge sets, extravagant costumes, and a large cast to create spectacular productions. After the wars, taboos were broken and the new writers, directors, and actors emerged with different views. Many played with the idea of reality, some were radically political, others channeled naturalism and questioned the legitimacy of previously unassailable beliefs. Towards the end of the century, the term theatre of Zurism came into the use due to the amount of plays conjuring the past in order to confront and accept it. Playwrights towards the end of the century count among their numbers Samuel Beckett, Harold Pinter, Andrew Webber, Brian Friel, Carol Churchill, and Tom Stoppard, that we can say their works was famous in the spirit of time. The last act of the century was a turn back towards realism, as well as the founding of Europe's first children's cultural centre. Irish playwright George Bernard Shaw, more than 60 plays during his lifetime, and was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1925. Here given a picture of George Bernard Shaw. Now I'd like to give full information for this. I'd like to show you video about George Bernard Shaw.
"If I am sane, the rest of the world ought not to be at large," wrote George Bernard Shaw in 1939. The Irish author was famous for his wit and sly humour, and delighted in shaking up the social conservatism of early 20th century Britain. Shaw's mother eloped with her voice teacher when Shaw was a teenager, and he later joined her in London, where he earned his living ghostwriting her lover's music column for Hornet magazine. Shaw started to make a name for himself as an art, music and drama critic, but failed to get any of his novels published. His first play, Widowers' Houses, was performed in 1892, and 63 plays, many of them among the best in the English language, followed. From Man and Superman to Androcles and the Lion, Shaw skewered the sensibilities of the time with a penetrating view of social inequalities and a finely honed satiric eye. He often used historic stories to highlight current issues, and by the time Pygmalion came to the British stage in 1914, he had a reputation for concealing political and social debate in witty farces. Of all his plays, Pygmalion had the biggest impact on popular culture. Shaw helped adapt it into an award-winning Hollywood film in 1938, and it formed the basis of Lerner and Loewe's 1956 Broadway musical, My Fair Lady. But the musical version could not be created until after Shaw's death. As the writer was so unhappy with Oscar Strauss's 1908 musical adaptation of one of his earlier plays, he forbade any further musical versions of his work. A passionate Fabian, Shaw was committed to social justice and socialist ideals. He married fellow socialist Charlotte Payne Townsend in 1898, and they remained married until his death, aged 94. Shaw was profoundly affected by the carnage of World War I, and he was bitterly opposed to the war. In 1919, he released Heartbreak House, which warned of the perils of trusting incompetent and unscrupulous leaders with the reins of power. But he had great respect for his fellow intellectuals, and in 1930 was happy to pay tribute to Albert Einstein at the joint British Committee Authors' Day dinner.
There is always a great deal to conceal. If you take the typical great man of our historic epoch, and suppose that I had to rise here tonight to propose the toast of Napoleon, well, undoubtedly I could say many very flattering things about Napoleon. But the one thing which I should not be able to say about him would be perhaps the most important thing. And that was that it would perhaps have been better for the human race if he had never been born.
Shaw first met Einstein in 1921, and the pair kept up a vigorous and stimulating correspondence for many years. They were united in their condemnation of Nazism.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have just paid a visit to the Grand Canyon.
In 1925, Shaw received the Nobel Prize for Literature in recognition of his outstanding body of work for the stage. He was in great demand as a speaker, and the press and public lapped up his witticisms, quirky political commentary, and eccentric humor.
Everybody said something about
He was happy to give offense when required, and was never more delighted than when he had the opportunity to deflate pretension or highlight hypocrisy.
You needn't be bothered with me.
By the 1930s, George Bernard Shaw was a household name across the English-speaking world.
I've been waiting for 4 hours. I haven't got the heart to refuse to say something. I shan't say anything about the Grand Canyon.
So, dear students, thank you for your attention. I think the video was understandable for you. Let's continue. George Bernard Shaw was born in July 1856 in Dublin. In 1876, he moved to London, where he wrote regularly but struggled financially. In 1895, he became a theatre critic for the Saturday Review and began writing plays of his own. His play Pygmalion was later made into a film twice, and the screenplay he wrote for the first version of it won an Oscar. So, in a period of his work, we can mention that he won most of famous prizes like a Nobel and the Oscar. During his lifetime, he wrote more than 60 plays and won many other awards, among them the Nobel Prize that I mentioned above this. Early on, Shaw explored the worlds of the arts, music, art, literature, and his mother's guidance, and through regular visits to National Gallery of Ireland. So, in 1872, Shaw's mother left her husband and took Bernard Shaw's two sisters to London, and 4 years later, Shaw followed his younger sister, had died in the meantime, also deciding to become a writer. Shaw struggled financially, and his mother essentially supported him while he spent time in British Museum reading room working on his first novels. So, unfortunately, despite the time he spent writing them, his novels were small failures, widely rejected by publishers. So, Shaw soon turned his attention to politics and the activities of the British intelligentsia, joining the Fabian Society in 1884. The Fabian Society was a socialist group whose goal was nothing short of the transformation of England through a more vibrant political and intellectual base. And Shaw became heavily involved, even editing a famous tract the group published, like a Fabian essay in Socialism in 1889. The year after he joined the Fabian Society, Shaw landed some writing work in the form of book reviews and art, music, and theatre criticism. And in 1895, he was brought the Saturday Review as its theatre critic. It was at this point that Shaw began writing plays of his own. So now I'd like to introduce you about famous work of shows. It is a Pygmalion, one of the show's most famous plays, was adapted to big screen in 1938, earning show an Academy Award for writing the screenplay. Pygmalion went on the further fame when it was adapted into a musical and became a hit, first on a Broadway stage with Rex Harrison and Julie Andrews, and later on screen in 1964 with Harrison and Audrey Hepburn. Shaw died in 1950 at the age 94 while working on yet another play. So, dear students, thank you for your attention. I think the lecture was understandable for you. Be ready for the seminar classes. See you at the lectures. Dear students, now I'd like to give additional information for George Bernard Shaw's work, which is named Pygmalion. So, please watch the video. And this is his work. So, dear students, thank you for your attention. I think the video was understandable for you. Let's continue. George Bernard Shaw was born in July 1856 in Dublin. In 1876 he moved to London, where he wrote regularly but struggled financially. In 1895 he became a theatre critic for the Saturday Review and began writing plays of his own. His play Pygmalion was later made into a film twice, and the screenplay he wrote for the first version of it won an Oscar. So, in a period of his work, we can mention that he won most of famous prizes like a Nobel and the Oscar. During his lifetime, he wrote more than 60 plays and won many other awards, among them the Nobel Prize that I mentioned above. First, early on, Shaw explored the worlds of the arts, music, art, literature, and his mother's guidance, and through regular visits to National Gallery of Ireland. So, in 1872, Shaw's mother left her husband and took Bernard Shaw's two sisters to London, and 4 years later Shaw followed. His younger sister had died in the meantime, also deciding to become a writer. Shaw struggled financially, and his mother essentially supported him while he spent time in British Museum reading room working on his first novels. So, unfortunately, despite the time he spent writing them, his novels were dismal failures, widely rejected by publishers. So, Shaw soon turned his attention to politics and the activities of the British intelligentsia, joining the Fabian Society in 1884. The Fabian Society was a socialist group whose goal was nothing short of the transformation of England through a more vibrant political and intellectual base. And Shaw became heavily involved, even editing a famous tract the group published, like a Fabian essay in Socialism in 1889. The year after he joined the Fabian society, Shaw landed some writing work in the form of book reviews and art, music, and theater criticism. And in 1895, he was brought abroad the Saturday Review as its theater critic. It was at this point that Shaw began writing plays of his own. So now I'd like to introduce you about a famous work of Shaw's. It is a Pygmalion, one of the Shaw's most famous plays, was adapted to big screen in 1938, earning Shaw an Academy Award for writing the screenplay. Pygmalion went on the further fame when it was adapted into a musical and became a hit, first on a Broadway stage with Rex Harrison and Julie Andrews, and later on screen in 1964 with Harrison and Audrey Hepburn. Shaw died in 1950 at the age 94 while working on yet another play. So, dear students, thank you for your attention. I think the lecture was understandable for you. Be ready for the seminar classes. See you at the lectures. Dear students, now I'd like to give additional information for George Bernard Shaw's work, which is named Pygmalion. So please watch the video and this is his work.
In the introduction of the play Pygmalion, a sudden downpour has pedestrians in Covent Garden sprinting for shelter or taxis. Beneath the portico of St. Paul's Church, a young Cockney flower girl, an older gentleman, and a man taking notes on the flower girl's speech are gathered. In the rising action, it becomes clear that the note-taking man is only interested in phonetically noting the flower girl's curbstone English. He boasts that he could teach her to speak like a duchess in 3 months. It turns out that he is the famous phonetician Henry Higgins. The elderly gentleman is Colonel Pickering, an admirer and fellow speech expert. Higgins invites Pickering to come around the next day to his home on Wimpole Street. The next morning, the flower girl, Eliza Doolittle, boldly shows up at Higgins's home, where she offers to pay him to teach her to talk more genteel. Pickering, who is present, says he will cover all expenses if, in 6 months, Higgins can pass Eliza off as a lady. Higgins accepts the bet and begins tutoring Eliza in speech and manners. Months later, Higgins takes Eliza on a surprise visit to his mother, an intelligent and dignified lady. It's a test of her newly learned skills. Eliza now looks and acts the part of a fine lady, but her vocabulary and unfortunate choice of topics gives away her humble beginnings. With some difficulty, Higgins covers her gaffes, while Freddie is smitten with Eliza. Overall, the test is a marginal success. Later, Mrs. Higgins scolds her son and Pickering both for treating Eliza like a doll, especially for not considering what will happen to Eliza when the experiment is over. Months later, after Eliza has honed her skills, Higgins and Pickering put Eliza's talents to the test, and she performs flawlessly. Back at the Wimpole Street laboratory, Higgins and Pickering congratulate themselves on their victory. With no thought of Eliza, they dismissively proclaim the experiment over. Higgins starts upstairs, but then returns to get his slippers and finds Eliza weeping with rage. In the play's climax, Eliza is enraged by Higgins' insensitivity. She won his bet for him, and now she thinks that he will toss her back into the gutter. The stormy scene ends with Higgins slamming the door and leaving. In the falling action, Higgins learns Eliza is, in fact, staying with his mother, who defends Eliza's choice to leave him and Pickering. A calm, composed Eliza comes downstairs and greets the men, thanking Pickering for treating her with respect from the very beginning. But she says she no longer needs Higgins, and she will not come back. Higgins accuses her of ingratitude, but still holds out hopes for her return. In the resolution, Eliza leaves. Higgins remains unsure about whether or not she is gone for good. There are 7 central characters in the play Pygmalion. Higgins is an authority on phonetics, described as a robust, vital, appetizing sort of man of 40 or thereabouts, and is an energetic, scientific type. He is also careless about people's feelings. This trait becomes most evident in his treatment of Eliza, whom he transforms from a flower girl into an upper-class lady. His inability to see and treat Eliza as anything more than an experiment forces her to take a stand for independence and self-respect. While Higgins remains fundamentally unchanged by the end of the play, he gains a new perspective on Eliza and views her with respect. Eliza Doolittle, also called Liza, is introduced as a dirty, shabbily dressed flower girl in need of a dentist. Her Cockney accent places her in London's lower class, yet her intelligence and ambition allow her to aspire to something finer. In Higgins' laboratory, she is transformed into a lady who can pass for a duchess. Her real transformation comes with being treated like a lady and gaining self-respect. Colonel Pickering is the author of spoken Sanskrit and is a master of Indian dialects. He is an elderly gentleman of the amiable military type, and throughout the play, he demonstrates a generous and courteous nature. He's kind to Eliza as she changes from a flower girl to a lady. Doolittle is described as an elderly but vigorous dustman. A happy member of the undeserving poor, he recklessly spends money he borrows from others. He has no morals at all and is willing to turn his daughter over to Higgins, no questions asked, for £5. Mrs. Higgins is a gracious member of the upper class. Her affection for Higgins does not shield her from irritation at his lack of manners, and she is adept at putting him in his place. Intelligent and perceptive, she soon discerns the problems that her son's experiment will cause for Eliza. Freddie is a young man and a member of the upper class, good-natured though somewhat weak, and a true gentleman. He is infatuated with Eliza. At the end of the play, Eliza suggests that she might marry Freddie, though he has no money to support them both and may seem unfit for work. But he is devoted to her, unlike Higgins, and he won't try to make her something that she is not. Mrs. Pierce is Higgins's housekeeper. She has a strong sense of propriety and takes it upon herself to be sure that Eliza is cared for properly while in the house. A bond between Eliza and Mrs. Pierce grows, and Mrs. Pierce frequently pushes Higgins to show consideration for Eliza and to think about Eliza's future. The flower shop, clothing, and the mirror are symbols in Pygmalion. The flower shop represents the dream that drives Eliza to Higgins's laboratory. After all, the shop won't hire Eliza unless she is able to, as she puts it, talk more genteel. It is a dream for which she is willing to transform herself. By the end of the play, Eliza has developed the manners and habits that disqualify a fine lady from earning her own living. Though Higgins reminds her about her dream of working in a florist shop, Eliza may have outgrown that particular dream and will have to rethink her future. Clothing reflects the social status of characters. For example, Higgins's slippers represent his class as well as his disregard for Eliza. As a symbol, clothing represents Eliza's metamorphosis from flower girl to lady, and Doolittle's rise from dustman to gentleman. Eliza's father in particular illustrates the notion that a change of clothing may alter other people's perceptions. When he makes an entrance in Act 2, clad in the costume of his profession, he is happy and proud to be one of the undeserving poor. By Act 5, his unlooked-for rise in wealth is apparent when he arrives at the home of Mrs. Higgins, wearing a fashionable frock coat with white waistcoat and gray trousers, dazzling silk hat, and patent leather shoes. He appears every inch a gentleman and is announced as such by the parlor maid. However, his new look is misleading. While his social standing has risen, his only gentlemanly attributes are those that have been forced upon him as middle-class morality claims its victim. In Act 2, Eliza is shocked to find a mirror in her new bathroom. She doesn't know which way to look, and finally hangs a towel over it. This represents the moment when Eliza unguardedly sees herself as she is, dirty, disheveled, and far from ladylike in her personal habits. Cloaked in a blue cotton kimono, she emerges looking like a dainty and exquisitely clean young Japanese lady. Eliza's glimpse in the mirror reveals to her the need for a change, and the results of taking a bath prove that change is possible. Thus, the mirror symbolizes self-awareness and identity. Language is a class barrier. Transformation, appearance and identity, and femininity are the themes of Pygmalion. Through the character of Higgins, George Bernard Shaw reminds the audience that articulate speech is a divine gift, and the eloquent words of Shakespeare, Milton, and the Bible form the basis of their native tongue. Shaw emphasizes the hierarchy of English society through characters from different socioeconomic levels. Eliza, with her Cockney dialect, is associated with the lowest social rank, whereas Higgins and Pickering represent the elite. The power of language to break through social barriers is fully realized in Eliza's transformation. Yet she can speak nothing but Higgins' language, which cuts her off from her former life. Shaw explores the theme of transformation by showing how a poor flower girl becomes a self-reliant lady. Eliza's metamorphosis happens under the tutelage of Higgins, who eventually refers to her as a creature, an allusion to Mary Shelley's 1818 novel Frankenstein. The professor does not realize his experiment represents a more important transformation than class. It's the awakening of Eliza's soul. All three facets of Eliza's transformation, sight, sound, and soul, come together when at last she breaks free of Higgins. Throughout the play, the theme of appearance and identity speaks to the social status of characters. Language, dress, wealth, and their manners and morality all serve as indicators of social class. Yet these signs are superficial. Victorian values strictly define the status and functions for women and established firm boundaries for femininity among social classes. In Pygmalion, Shaw illustrates these class boundaries and roles through various characters, especially Eliza, a member of the working class poor, Mrs. Pierce, Higgins' housekeeper, and Mrs. Higgins, an upper-class lady of some wealth who has raised a family and keeps a home. Shaw aims to show in Pygmalion that such boundaries, with their fixed roles and definitions of femininity, are artificial. Shaw envisions a new ideal in Pygmalion, a free-spirited, educated, self-reliant, and career-minded woman. Pygmalion and Galatea is the motif central to George Bernard Shaw's famed play, Pygmalion. The basis for Shaw's Pygmalion is a Greek myth retold by the ancient Roman poet Ovid in his masterwork, Metamorphoses. Young Pygmalion sees women as so inherently morally flawed that he rejects all thoughts of marriage and resolves to live alone. Nevertheless, he uses his great skill as a sculptor to carve out of ivory a woman so perfect that he falls in love with her. Sure enough, she is so beautifully fashioned that she seems to live and breathe, and as time passes, Pygmalion's adoration grows. One day, at the festival of Venus, the goddess of love, beauty, and sexuality, Pygmalion offers a prayer that he might be given a wife like his ivory virgin. The goddess hears and understands what the young man doesn't dare directly ask, that his creation may become his wife. Venus decides to grant the sculptor's wish. Upon returning home, he kisses the statue and finds that he is not touching cold ivory, but warm, yielding flesh. Venus is given life to the sculpture, and her name is Galatea. Like Pygmalion, Higgins becomes Eliza's creator, using the power of language to sculpt a lady from a draggle-tailed gutter snipe. Like the scores of American millionairesses whom he is taught to speak, Eliza is nothing more than a block of wood from which he will carve a duchess. In the final stage of her transformation, a surge of passion brings Eliza to life, and she becomes aware that she is an independent being, separate from her creator and able to stand on her own. In the play's dramatic conclusion, Higgins is left behind in his mother's drawing room as Eliza sweeps out, no longer an immobile creature, but an individual able to make her own way. The creation has broken free of its creator. Shaw's ending is markedly different from Ovid's. In Shaw's Pygmalion, Higgins, unlike his ancient counterpart, does not get to keep his Galatea. In fact, he is exposed as foolishly misguided. In this way, Shaw seems to reject the Ovidian version. It's worth noting that Ovid also reveals an ironic attitude toward many of his characters, but Ovid doesn't make his disapproval nearly as explicit as George Bernard Shaw does. For Ovid, Pygmalion might be silly and rigid, but he gets exactly what he wants.